Anyway, let me tell you a little bit maybe about myself first, and then I'll tell you about the book. Since you may not know, but I'm Canadian, actually. I grew up in Kingston. You all know where Kingston is? Everybody knows where Kingston is? And my father was, he's retired now, but he was a professor of engineering at Queen's University. And so he's much better at writing equations on the blackboard than I am. I don't know, I'm not going to write any equations on the board today. Is everybody an engineering student here? What do you study?
Public policy.
Public policy, okay.
Artistic.
Excellent, okay, we're in the humanities. Anybody else? Or are you all else? Everybody else is engineering. Yes, like good Egyptians, yeah. So my father is from Alexandria, my mother's from Cairo. And they met in Switzerland a long time ago when they were studying. They were both doing their PhDs in Switzerland at the time. So I was born in Switzerland, as was my older sister and older brother. And then we moved to Canada when I was very young. And my father got the job at Queen's University. And so we would go back and forth to Egypt, but I've lived pretty much all my life outside of Egypt. And mostly in Canada, and then when I finished my undergraduate, I went to Columbia University to do graduate work, and I was very interested in the work of Edward Said. Are people familiar with Edward Said? Some, yes. Okay, so Edward Said was a Palestinian-American academic. He wrote a book called Orientalism that was very influential and very much changed the course of how people in the humanities especially, but people think about representations of Arabs and Muslims. And he was very much an integral part of the Palestinian struggle himself. He was part of the Palestine National Council. He passed away in 2003. He had leukemia, and he passed away. But I had a good relationship with Edward, and eventually a friend of mine and myself, we co-edited a book of his writings, the Inside Reader, as Shahad mentioned, and thank you, Shahad, for putting this together. And so I've lived in New York City now, actually, for quite a while. I lived there prior to 9/11, and I've lived there after 9/11. I've lived in Canada, always prior to 9/11. And so I know what it's like to live as an Arab, as a Muslim, in Canada, in the United States, in the West. When I was 11 years old, we moved back to Switzerland for a year. My father did a sabbatical where they did their PhDs, my mother and my father. And then I lived in Switzerland for a couple of summers and in Germany for a year. So I'm very familiar with what it's like to live as a minority, I guess you could say, in the West. And a lot of the things that have happened, I think, in the post-9/11 period are not necessarily new. Certainly there's been a representation, there's been an image, there's been a stereotype of Arabs and Muslims that's been around for a very long time, often attached to ideas of, oppressing women or violence that's attached to them and these sorts of things. But I think something really different did happen after 9/11. It may not be that it's new, but the scale is very different. The degree to which it affects our daily lives, I think, is now very different. And I think that's certainly true, not just in the United States, but also in Canada now, especially as we see with the recent election. In Canada, I'm sure you're following the debates. Suddenly, the thought has become like the defining issue for Canada in a really limited and terrible way. So I think that one of the major differences in the United States, if you think about it, when you're talking about the relationship of Muslims to the rest of the country, also, is that when people in the United States thought about Islam and thought about Muslims prior to 9/11, they tended to think about Muslims generally as over there, not as part of the American story, as it were. If at all they did think about Muslims prior to 9/11, I think if you asked an average American who was an example of a Muslim, maybe they would say Muhammad Ali, the boxer, right? Or Malcolm X, as you had just read the autobiography of Malcolm X. So they would have thought about Islam within the trajectory, you could say, of African American politics, of the African American story. Now, after 9/11, I think if you say name a Muslim to an American, he's probably going to say Osama bin Laden. And that's a very bad trajectory to follow, it seems to me. Not only that, but also the image of the Muslim has also changed then. If you had the idea of the Muslim prior to 9/11 in the United States as being essentially African American and connected to the African American experience, which is a very interesting history that has a long history. Suddenly, after 9/11, the image really changed to being an immigrant, somebody who looks like you and me, who tends to be brown-skinned, dark-haired, and not, the idea of the dangerous immigrant, like somehow we are a fifth column, like we are a dangerous element to the society that's really unwelcome. And so that really was a change. And I guess you could say I've lived through that change since I was in New York City on 9/11, on September 11th, 2001, a day that I will remember, I think, forever. It was a very powerful day, and a very somber day in a lot of ways, as I'm sure you can imagine. And it was a day, that period was a really interesting period in that the day itself and the couple of weeks that followed it in New York City were very interesting, I think. For one thing, because the mood in New York was really a mood of mourning, of sadness, of remembering the people who had died, of also not ever wanting something like this ever to happen again, of reflection on the United States' role in the world, of reflection on American foreign policy. The mood in the United States, the mood in New York City at that time was actually, I think, one that was fairly productive and rather introspective. Only later, especially when President George Bush, when he was president, then he came to New York and then he had a press conference that was at the site at Ground Zero, and he, like a cowboy, was saying, we're going to get them dead or alive, and these sorts of things. The mood in the whole country was really one of vengeance. And I think at that time, too, in New York, you could start to see the mood shift in New York as well. And of course, around that time, too, there are so many things happening. And this continued to happen at really an extraordinary pace since then. Right after 9/11, there was an immediate drumbeat to war in Afghanistan. And it took, it took about a month for the war in Afghanistan then to actually begin. And then right after the war in Afghanistan began, then there was, of course, the drumbeat to war in Iraq. And then right after that, there was a program called special registration that was begun in the United States, where all Muslim immigrant males from 25 majority Muslim countries had to register their whereabouts with the government. I don't know if you are familiar with this program. Most people are not familiar with it, even in the United States, but within the Muslim communities in the United States, it had an enormous impact. And in fact, many of the Muslims were then fleeing to Canada. Something that we've seen quite often in the history of Canada and the United States. During the days of slavery, for example, many of the slaves would flee to Canada because that's where they could get freedom. During the days of the Vietnam War, that was a time when a lot of people who were not didn't believe in the Vietnam War also fled to Canada. In fact, when I was growing up in Kingston, many of my teachers had been Americans who had lived in Canada for a very long time because they had left the United States because of the Vietnam War. And now we saw that replicated again. And in fact, another interesting thing that happened during the time of special registration was that people who had dual nationality, who are both Canadians and somebody else, somewhere else from one of these 25 Muslim majority countries, the US government was still making them register as well. And at that time, Canada actually registered an official diplomatic complaint against the United States because they said, look, a Canadian should be a Canadian. It doesn't matter if this is a Canadian Egyptian or a Canadian Syrian or what have you. And for countries that are supposed to be as close and brotherly and neighborly as the United States and Canada, that's a big statement to make, to register a diplomatic complaint against the country. So special registration is one example of many of the things that have happened since the terrorist attacks. And I think, it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to understand that there's been so many different elements of this that have happened throughout the whole culture. Basically, a law enforcement apparatus has really developed with the idea of the suspicious Muslim, that somehow Muslims are ready to invade and to take over the American society. To the degree where in August of 2011, the Associated Press released a series of reports that somebody within the New York City Police Department was giving them secret documents. And these documents were indicating that the New York City Police Force was involved in a massive program of spying against the Muslim community in New York City. And in fact, they were not spying on people that they thought were suspicious. They were spying on everybody. And And what they were doing was they were looking at everybody who was going to any kind of mosque. They were writing down license plate numbers. They were getting people to fill out, to people who were on their own payroll to tell people who were coming into the mosque and not into the mosque, etc. They were going to different restaurants where people ate. They were restaurants where they had on the TV. Had Al Jazeera on the TV. That was considered to be a suspicious place. They were going to different places where people got their hair cut. They were going to infiltrating sports teams. It was this enormous thing. They were going to travel agencies. The reports, I read through the reports that the AP had because they put them on the website after a while. They said things like, went to such and such travel agency. Russia recommends Royal Jordanian Airlines. I mean, it was just an enormous waste of resources as well, because what information are you actually getting? One of the things that they also found out was that many of the police would dress up in plain clothes and they would go to all of these different locations. And as they would go to the locations, they would have to fill out a form within the police bureaucracy because of their duties and to get reimbursed for expenses and things like that. And they kept on going back to some of the dessert, the sweet shops, right? The places that were selling all the halawat, like all the balawan and everything, right? And so, at one point, then some of the police commanders were getting very suspicious. Why do the police always go to these shops? And they were always going to the same shops at the end of their shifts. Until it became clear, they were asking the investigators, and the investigators said, well, because they had the best sweets, and they were just getting the sweets to take home before the end of their shift. So it's so ridiculous. I mean, I think this was just, you get the ridiculousness of it all. And at one point, too, when this all came out, there was another report that had been secretly leaked to one of the journalists. And he said that they were also spies on campuses and who were infiltrating Muslim student associations. And then they were talking about the different Muslim student associations that were considered to be, of interest, as they said, right? And so there was a couple that were of interest, including at Brooklyn College. I teach at Brooklyn College. And then they said, within the report, it said that of particular interest was a lecturer of Middle Eastern descent. So I was thinking, is that me? At which point then the Associated Press then called me up on the phone and they said, do you think it's you? And then the New York Times called me on the phone and they said, do you think it's you? And I said, I don't know. I mean, why would they be spying on me? I have no idea why they would spy on me. And then a friend, somebody that I do know, talked to the journalist and he saw the report and he told me that it wasn't me. So as far as I know, you never know. It could have been me. If it wasn't that report, maybe it was something else. And so this is the kind of terrain that people are living through. And it's one that's very, very corrosive to, not just to the relations between the police department and the community, but even within the community, because people are very suspicious of people who are coming to the mosques that they don't know, who are trying to come to the different functions and community organizations and these things. That there's a lot of, a lot of suspicion and worry about these sorts of things. So, this is this is what, in short, this is what's sort of happened over the last 14 years or so. And many years ago, I decided that I wanted to write something about these sorts of stories that I was hearing from the community, from people around me, that I felt weren't being represented within the mainstream. So one of the things I did was then because at that time too, what I was doing was I was doing a lot of responding to all of the different kinds of events that were happening all over the place. I was writing a lot of op-eds, I was giving a lot of lectures here and there, doing these kinds of things. But there was always something that was happening in the news, so I was always trying to respond to what was happening in the news. And at a certain point, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. What I decided I wanted to do was to stop, to reflect, to take a breath, to think about something more generally, and to really find a place to catalog some of the events, to talk about what it's like for people generally within the community. And so that decision led me to write my first book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? In which what I do in that book is I follow around 7 young different Arab Americans, 6 of whom are from Muslim backgrounds, and one is a Christian, he's half Palestinian, half Egyptian, Christian Arab American. And I wanted to get what their stories were like. And so I spent a lot of time with them. I wrote all their kinds of stories. And it was really an attempt to try to get both a place where Arabs and Muslims could find in a book their experiences represented, but also a place where maybe the general public could read the book and find a place to read what these experiences would be like. Because it seems to me that, in fact, the general public has very little clue about what it means to live as an Arab or a Muslim within the United States, and probably within Canada as well. In the United States, the Muslim population is probably about only 1% of the population. It's a very, very small percentage of the population. And in fact, surveys also show that 62% of the American public, 62%, almost 2/3 of the American public, say that they've never even met a Muslim. 62%. And yet I'm pretty sure 100% have an opinion about Muslims, and probably not very positive opinion. And so that makes the kinds of representations that you find in media and elsewhere extremely important. With a lot of other groups, it's also, you might have a stereotypical image somewhere, but oftentimes when you know somebody, it offsets that stereotype, and so you see that image as being very thin because you have a real relationship with somebody. And in fact, the other polling data bears that out. People who actually do know somebody who's Muslim have a much lower level of hostility towards Islam than the ones who don't know a Muslim. So I think in some ways, representations are really, really important, and so I was trying to do my own little bit with that. I still try to do my own little bit with that in my writing. And so over the years, I've been writing a lot of different essays about these sorts of things. And this is the culmination of these essays, is this book, This Muslim American Life. This is supposed to be me on the cover, by the way. And in fact, just the other day, there was a book festival in Brooklyn where I live. And so NYU Press had a table at the book festival. So they asked me to come to the table so I could sign books or whatever. So I came to the table one afternoon. And then as I came, they were like, oh, you just missed it. Somebody was here. And he said, he looked at the cover of the book and he said, that doesn't look like Obama. Which is so ridiculous at so many levels. Anyway, so, but in the book, what I really try to do is I try to talk about the ways in which Muslim American life has been really simplified and discussed on 4 different levels. And so I talk about Muslims in history, American history, Muslims I say Muslims in theory. In theory, I mean sort of like cultural theory when we talk about Orientalism and these sorts of things that I talked about. So in the representational logic of that. Muslims in politics and Muslims in culture. And so I'm looking at all the ways that the American culture now really is like dealing with Islam and with the Muslim populations. For example, and there's so many interesting little tidbits that people I think generally don't know. For one, in New York City, where I live now, that's where the World Trade Center used to be. And it's where the World Trade Center used to be, not just half a block away. It's like right down the street from where it used to be, is where the center of the old Arab community in New York City was in the late 19th century. It was called Little Syria. Most of the people had come from what's today Lebanon, but it was called Little Syria. And it was a thriving area for the Arab community. And in fact, up until the early part of the 20th century, there was a mosque there that was a Turkish mosque. And so there's a really rich history that Americans really, in effect, are not just, either they're oblivious to it, they're ignorant of it, or it's a kind of willful denial of it. The 9/11 museum, there's now a museum open that's memorializing the attacks. And the 9/11 museum has they have pamphlets in many different languages, but they don't have pamphlets in Arabic. In fact, they kind of refuse to issue pamphlets in Arabic for the museum. They have a narrative about what happened about the attacks that represents Islam and Muslims very badly, to the point where people were making a lot of noise about that, trying to get that to be changed, but it still hasn't been changed. So the ideological uses of this idea of the image of the Muslim and of Islam are very profound in American society today. Another interesting history that I think a lot of people don't know is that Islam in the United States actually goes back all the way to before the United States. What I mean by that is there was a large number of people who came from Africa in chains who were enslaved, because many of the people who came from Africa as slaves came from West Africa. And West Africa is quite Muslim. Many parts of West Africa are very Muslim. In fact, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, when people were forced to come to the United States and were slaves, many of them could, in fact, read and write Quran. Some of them were Hafiz al-Quran. They knew the whole Quran by heart. And there was an image of the African back in the 19th century that said that the African was essentially stupid. Right? I'm using the words that the philosophers used back then. That idea of the African was stupid, which is the idea that not only were Africans stupid, but that meant that their role in life was to labor. That's why there was a justification for slavery, right? I mean, nowadays, of course, we would see that as being abhorrent, but this was the justification at the time. And one of the ways that justification was legitimated was the fact that Africans could not read and write. And to the point where they also, in some slave states, when slavery was alive in the United States, in some slave states, there were laws that forbid people from teaching Africans how to read and write. So when they would see, the general public would see people, these African slaves, who were writing in Arabic, they were shocked, actually, because they were seeing this literacy, even though they couldn't read what they were writing. And it was interesting because at the time, with a few examples of this, when people were discovered to have been writing Arabic, they looked very African enough to be slaves. And then as soon as their literacy was discovered, they were considered to be Arabs instead. So at that point, being Arab was considered to be a little bit better than being African. I'm not sure if that's still the case in the United States. There's another great book by a historian named Peter Wood, who talks about in colonial South Carolina. So this is before the United States and the United States is still a colony of Britain. And in colonial South Carolina, the book is called Black Majority because the majority of the people who lived there were in fact black, were Africans. There were more there's a greater slave population than a non-slave population. Right? And there's a line in his book that says, in colonial South Carolina, Mustafa was a fairly common name. And I read this, I'm thinking, that's my name. So this is a rich part of American history that is in fact denied when we see Islam is only beginning essentially on September 11th, 2001 in the United States. So I investigate some of that in this book. I look at the fact that in fact in the 40s and 50s there was a lot of interest within African American culture also for Islam again. In fact, it had come in an interesting way through the Ahmadiyya movement. You know the Ahmadiyya movement from Pakistan? You know the Ahmadis? Familiar with them at all? Yeah. So they're a fringe element of the Islamic community, but they're very active in proselytizing and in trying to get new people to join, etc. So they had gone to different parts of the world in order to try to get people to join. And in fact, they came to the United States as well. And a lot of the people who joined the Ahmadiyya movement were African Americans also at that time. And the people who were joining the Ahmadiyya movement were also, many of them, were many of the most famous jazz musicians at the time. And there's a way in which you can hear many of the sounds of Islam, as it were. You can hear things like, it's almost like different kinds of dhikr, that you can hear in some of the music. And so I have a chapter about that in this book as well, looking at how Islam is historically, even within the sonic architecture, you could say, of American history. So that's sort of like looking at the historical side of things. And then from the, in the Islam in theory section of the book, I want to attack, I actually write an essay where I'm attacking Hirsi Ali. You know Hirsi Ali? Yeah. Isn't she terrible? Yeah. Okay, at least we can all agree on that. And what's her name? Irshad Manji, who's a Canadian. You know Irshad Manji? Her star was a little bit brighter a few years ago. Thankfully, it's dimmed a little bit since then. But the ways in which I feel like people like Irshad Manji, Hirsi Ali, and even, I talk in that chapter, Reza Aslan. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with Reza Aslan. Reza is a little bit better because he's like, you know, he's just not as terrible and right-wing as the others. But it seems to me that what they're doing is they're still, all three of them are still trading in a certain kind of Orientalism, the idea that Edward Said had developed, you know, which essentially says that Orientalism says that the way that the West looks at the Muslim world is through a very, very simplistic lens, where everything that Muslims ever do will always be motivated only and solely by Islam. And so you don't get the idea of a complexity of human society in the way that Westerners look at other kinds of societies or even their own society. And so it seems to me that Irshad Manji, Hirsi Ali, and Reza Aslan also do that through their works, through their books. So I had to do the very painful thing of reading Irshad Manji and Hirsi Ali's books for that chapter. Or I talk about Muslims in politics in the book as well. So I look at the ways in which, for example, I mean, the book came out obviously very recently, so I don't talk about the latest flare-ups with people like Donald Trump or Ben Carson, and these, you know, the way that they're in the United States, the way that the idea of the Muslim is a very useful idea for politics because they can just, you know, they use us as the essentially as a kind of wedge politics, as a kind of gutter politics that you can just like rally people around this idea that the Muslim is about to take over. In the United States, there's a very, very strong conservative movement that actually believes, and I'm not exaggerating, that believes that Muslims in general in the United States are just sitting and waiting for that day when they can come in and essentially usurp the Constitution and impose Sharia law all over the United States, which is, of course, a ridiculous idea. But people really believe it to the point where they've had state legislatures in more than 30 states in the United States pass legislation that says that the courts will not accept either Sharia law or foreign law in their courts. Which is also just it's a non-issue because, of course, in the American legal system, the American Constitution is the law of the land, not anything else. And so, you know, the fact that it is even a political issue that unites certain elements of the society is an indication of the political weakness also of the Muslim community within the United States. And then in the last section of the book, I talk about Muslims in culture. And I look at different things like Muslims in certain kinds of movies or in TV shows, and the ways in which they get represented, and the ways in which, you know, the war on terror gets represented, for example, in movies, in the way that the CIA gets represented. I have one chapter about the CIA in movies today, and it's very interesting because, in fact, I think most people don't know this fact either, but there's an office of the CIA. They have their own website, so you can go to that website. They have an office of the CIA. It's their like public relations wing, right, where they work closely hand in hand. They're always pitching stories to Hollywood, and Hollywood pitches stories back to them to get their help. And so, movies like Zero Dark 30, do you know Zero Dark 30, or Homeland, that TV show Homeland, you know, like these are actually done in close coordination with the CIA. These movies, and it's astonishing in a country that supposedly says that, you know, there's that propaganda, official propaganda, is not allowed within the borders of the United States. That's what the laws of the United States say. The United States does make some propaganda, but officially by law, propaganda can only be exported in the United States. That's what they say. But meanwhile, you get these Hollywood ventures that are actually working hand in hand with the CIA. So there's a chapter that's looking at that example. Or there's another chapter that I wrote. Maybe I'll read a little bit from this chapter, and then you know, I really would much rather have this become a conversation rather than just me just talking to you, because I do this for a living, so I don't want to just talk to you, because seeing people get bored by me talking is just what I do for a living. So I'd rather have a conversation. All right, but let me read this, and this is all true, by the way. Okay. So the chapter is called Coexistence. I was made aware of Mustafa Bayoumi. I was made aware of Mustafa Bayoumi exactly 3 months ago, when in a fit of egomania, I Googled myself. I do this only rarely, which is to say only a few times during the day and when I'm at my computer, but never at night or when I'm out with friends, because that would be rude and also self-centered. Yet, through this limited experience, I've learned that it's useful to type alternative spellings to my name, such as Mustafa Bayoumi with a PH, Mustafa Bayoumi with M-O-S-T, or even Mustafa Bayoumi with a Y at the end of it, into the search engine's inviting rectangle. Like everyone else, or so I imagine, I feel a kind of ontological concordance between the arrangement of letters that make up my name and the person I believe myself to be. But since my name is of Arabic origin, all Romanizations are approximations. What this means is that perhaps, unlike people who have always existed first in the Roman alphabet, I see myself equally in the alternatives. It's simply a question of transliteration. Spell me however you want, in other words, because all versions somehow revert back to their Arabic ancestor. As with most things, Google confirms my suspicions, since I invariably find listings about me in surrogate spellings. There are multiple versions of me out there, but they are still me. I'm going to skip a couple pages. So imagine my surprise. I'm on 243. So imagine my surprise when on that day, 3 months ago, as I was ego searching, which is a term I learned after Googling your name, I came across a reference to a novel that included a character named Mustafa Bayoumi. So there's a novel that has the character named Mustafa Bayoumi. At first, I was incredulous. It would be less remarkable to stumble across a character named Mustafa in a novel. Tayyip Saleh's Season of Migration to the North. Anybody has read that novel? The art historian has. Yeah. Tayyip Saleh's Season of Migration to the North features one very sexual but seriously messed up Mustafa Saeed. Or there's Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where Mustafa Mond holds the estimable job of first president, world controller for Western Europe. I've even read a novel with a character named Bayoumi, a villainous creature of misogyny found in Nawal Sadawi's Women at Point Zero. You know Nawal Sadawi? No? But this time was different. Unlike those examples, the name I was reading on the page, which in this case was a screen, was not simply Mustafa or just Bayoumi, but the unity of both, the yoking of the first to the last, Mustafa Bayoumi. This, I thought, is kind of weird. The website where I first found Mustafa Bayoumi looked amateurish, and since I wanted to find out if the book was real, I naturally went to Amazon.com. There I discovered the novel, titled Thou Shalt Kill. It's a detective story set in Pittsburgh, published in 2011 by an imprint of Simon & Schuster, and written by one Daniel Blake, which Amazon informed me was a pseudonym. The mystery was deepening. Google Books kindly allowed me to read a few pages from the novel, and from what I could gather, the plot included a murder at a church that followed an earlier killing of someone named Redwine. Two detectives, Berardino and Patrice, were considering if the murders were related. That's when Patrice says this: "There's no guarantee that this is even related to Redwine. True, could be copycat, could be coincidence, methods the same, locations completely different. Only a few people had come across to where Redwine was killed, had access to where Redwine was killed. Here, anybody could have come in off the street, literally. Few buildings more public than a cathedral. And why the smashing of the crucifix, the icon, the windows? None of that with Redwine, was there?" Patrice pointed out. "Someone who hates religion. Someone who hates Christianity, certainly. Someone like Mustafa Bayoumi." Berardino glanced across at Patrice. He seemed pretty hostile to it for sure. So we look at Bayoumi first. So I write this essay about the fact that I'm a terrorist character in this novel. It's an amusing, I think, amusing essay. But you'll have to decide if you think it's amusing. Anyway, so that's sort of the gist of the book on multiple levels. And curious to hear what your experiences are as well. You found that things in Canada have, as I said in the beginning, at least on the politics level, on the discursive level of politics, and the ways in which the image of the Muslim is being used in Canada now is very, it's something we should pay attention to, it seems to me. But I'm wondering what your own experiences are like as well. If you have any questions for me or any experiences to share, I'd be happy to hear them.